Hi everyone, Adrienne here from Core Health, back to bring you video 2 of our short series. Today I'm going to introduce you to understanding and having a little bit more of discovering of finding that simplicity in typical brain development and in deflected brain development. So today what I want to talk about is what are some of the things that we know? What are some of the things that we know about development, some of the things that we know about what's happening within our population right now. And one thing is for certain, we definitely know there is a lot of stress. There's a lot of stress, a lot of uncertainty, and it's in all different forms that people of all different ages are experiencing within our culture, our society, within our world. As you know, in all different realms, we have changing routines, we have changes in the way that we're doing academics, we have changes in the way that we're working, that we're able to engage with others within our own family, our extended families, in our friend groups. For all of us at different ages, there are different ways that we have had to connect and engage with our world. Different ways that we're working, everything is different, whether that's a good thing or bad thing, or maybe some on both sides. The reality of it all is that there is stress in the physical realm, the chemical realm, the emotional realm, and we really need to understand a little bit more about what that may be doing to the developing brain and the brain that's already fully developed. So when we look at the statistics, even before COVID entered our world and before all of these massive changes and stressful times became really obvious, we have to understand that there was already a lot of stress. There's a lot of stressors that may not have necessarily been there when you were growing up or when our parents were growing up. Could be in the form of physical, chemical, emotional stressors, all different types of things. So we sit more, maybe there's more screen time, maybe different chemicals in our food. Maybe the food that we're eating today isn't quite as nutritional as the food that we were eating, when our parents and grandparents were growing up. There's a lot of different things and they're happening in our world. So that definitely can come in the form of stressors. We're going to explore that a little bit more, but we really also need to understand that we have this emerging problem in our world even before COVID. And I think maybe we'll see this more post-COVID and during this time, but we have to understand that even before all of this in our country and in our world, we were already seeing and experiencing this rise in behavioral learning, socialization, and developmental challenge. We were seeing a massive rise in the way that children are moving through brain development and the way that they're engaging and connecting and learning in their environment and from our world. So we're already seeing really big challenges in that realm. Like some of them are really big challenges. So when we look at that and then we look at the statistics, of course, the thing that we have to look at and to say is not just, what profession or what's the one cause, what's the one reason, because I think we're trying to say that there's one thing, and there's probably not. That's probably not very intelligent of us because there's a multitude of things that we experience in our everyday, the physical, the chemical, the emotional realms every day, and they're different for every person. They might be different every day. The ability to handle stressors based on our genetics, on our epigenetics, all of that resilience that's within us, that's what makes up the ability or sets the stage for us to adapt to our stressors in our world. It all varies person to person, from day to day, from time to time, and even within the same person. So there's a lot of different reasons that we might be seeing this deflection or this increase in changes in the way that our brain is moving through development, and therefore the way that changes that our children are learning and connecting and engaging. So the one thing that we know for sure, we're seeing an increase in the challenges that we're having in the pediatric and the adolescent and even in the adult population too, with learning, behavior, and socialization. The only real thing, and this is what I always say when I'm working with doctors or with other practitioners, is that, look, we don't want to say there's one problem, right? What's the one cause? We can't say that. We need to look at the big picture of it all. We need to be able to look at all of the evidence that's out there. We need to be able to consume that evidence across multiple disciplines, not just one discipline. We're not just going to look solely at psychology or education or functional neurology, but we need to be able to look across multiple disciplines to be able to consume research and evidence in all of those different areas to make the case for ourselves to say, what do we know? What is it that we know so that we can start to build on that and start to understand how to support our children to facilitate better health, growth, and development. So that's what we're going to do in this video today. We're just going to talk about what we know. So what do we know? Well, we know a few things. One of the things that we know is that the brain is not fully developed at birth. We know we have to move through this trajectory of development, and we know that when we're born with a more primitive brain, which means that we're more active in our brain stems. So we have these things called infantile movement reflexes, and they facilitate the way that we're primarily engaging and surviving and connecting with others in our environment. So these are reflexes like if you do this to a newborn baby, you do this and they might turn their head like this and open their mouth. That's an infantile movement reflex, or also known as a primitive reflex. There's a lot of these reflexes and they're facilitated through our brainstem or the bottom of the brain. So that's the really active part of the brain that's there when we're in utero. And then that's the first thing that starts to develop in utero. And when we're first born, this is our very primitive way to engage and connect and learn and survive in our world. It's also the most efficient way in early life. So these primitive reflexes are the most efficient in early life. Now, what happens, the really cool thing is that as we move and we grow, and we start to develop, our brain starts to develop and becomes more sophisticated. So in a way, it's sort of like visualizing a flower. So think about the brain as a flower. And first of all, we have to be receiving information into the brain. So our brain needs to be fed information from our outside world. So that could be through our body movements, through our senses, through our sight, through our smell, through touch, through our movements, through love. All of these different things are helping to feed our brain through our nervous system. So, our nerves come down, through our touch, we might be on our fingertips. Information enters through our nerves, goes up through our spinal cord, through the spinal tracts, and all of these pathways and all this information that's being fed to the brainstem first and then sent to the midbrain and up, we're starting to make highways or connections or wires. And the way that happens is that we're getting information in, the brain is starting to be fed, and it starts to develop, and it opens up kind of like a flower. So it really opens up back to front, bottom up, inside to out, and right to left. And we end with that frontal lobe or the prefrontal cortex in the front of our brain. But we really start with this really primitive brain, and wherever we are in the trajectory of growth is where our tools come from. And that's what we use to engage and connect and learn from our world. So in the beginning and in utero, in early life, we have these things that are facilitated through the bottom of the brain. Doesn't mean that there's not any other activity going on in the brain. It just means that predominantly our most primary and most sophisticated way to process our world is living down here at this point in our brainstem. So in early life, we have these tools that are, of course, facilitated by where the brain is most active. These tools are called our primitive reflexes. That really allows us to have this early life movement patterns. So if you think about it, that's what really facilitates lifting the head up on tummy time, rolling, starting to crawl, finding food, sucking, latching, all of those early life movement things, all facilitated by primitive reflexes or body movements. And as we move through our development and our brain starts to open up, we become a little bit more sophisticated in our tools. And those primitive reflexes become something that we call integrated as the brain develops. So as the brain is being fed, information is moving up the brain through development, and we're getting more sophisticated in our tools. The next sophisticated way to process our world is through movement and touch. We become more coordinated and sophisticated in our big muscles first, and then to our smaller muscles. So this is facilitated again by where we are in brain development. So this is why we're interested. Is a baby able to hold their head up? Are they interested in tummy time? Do they have control of their trunk first? All of those big muscles, their core muscles. And then can they get up on their hands and knees and maybe start to rock back and forth? Do they start to do a crawling pattern? All of these stages are really important for development. They're all windows into where we are in our brain development, which is huge. Behavior is a window into the brain, and it always is. So then the more sophisticated we become in our gross motor skills, our fine motor skills, right? So our big motor muscles first, then our little fine motor muscles. Then we eventually move into the next stage of auditory verbalization in that second year of life. This is where you're starting to attend to noises. Maybe you're making a noise at me. I'm interested. I look back at you. It's not as sophisticated as language, but it starts with attending to my auditory verbal world. Again, doesn't mean that I don't have these other senses or tools to help process my world, like vision and movement. It just means that I'm becoming more sophisticated and I'm more into that auditory verbal realm, and noticing what's happening. And that's, of course, around that second year of life. So that's the seed of starting to engage in receptive and expressive language, which expressive being that I'm starting to engage in words and stringing words together and moving up in this hierarchical way. So again, the brain develops. As the brain's developing, we're getting more and more sophisticated tools, gives us a more sophisticated way to engage with our world. And that is why behavior is really a window into our brain and the development of the brain. So our final tool then that we develop is where we start to engage in something that we call visual cognitive function. So this is where we're starting to engage in the ability to use our mind's eye, or use visual cognition to visualize the future, to remember and visualize the past, to create imagery. And as humans, this is really our gift. This is this really efficient tool that comes from being fully developed. This is the ability to see with our mind. It gives us the seed of executive functioning, organization, planning, sequencing, and it's really the seat and the primary tool that we use for effective socialization. So socialization is kind of like a visual dance. It's a nonverbal visual dance, visual process, not like visual acuity of do I have 20/20 vision, but this is the ability to use my mind and my mind's eye to see what's emerging before, what's really effective and efficient, to help with academics, taking abstract symbols, turning them into images in our brain. So things like reading and writing. And then can I create abstract symbols from the ones that are in my brain? Can I recreate them? Am I retaining those images that I have in my brain? Multi-step instructions, being able to follow through with that, visual spatial awareness and organization of my space, executive functioning, planning for the future. Socialization, am I standing too close to you? Can I read your facial expressions, based on what I know and my awareness of tying in that visual cognitive sense with yours? So this is our highest tool. It's our most efficient tool that we have. And when we're fully um, developing that at 3, 4, 5 years old, when we start to develop this is where we like to see kids that are not just playing side by side anymore, but they're having that back and forth play. They're using this visual dance with learning how to engage outside of their own self. This is why we have a lot of pushback then with finding boundaries with kids when they start to emerge into that. It's a good thing. The challenge is when something obstructs us from moving through or interferes from moving through with this brain process of development in this efficient way. When that happens, that can cause deflections. So that's meaning that we didn't quite get there yet with visual cognitive function. So we're having to use these other tools then to process our world. That's a problem that would mean like to say that we're not there yet. So a primary tool a child or an adult has might still be in the movement touch realm. So they need to, in order to effectively and efficiently process their world, they need to move their bodies. They need to touch things. That's their primary mode of operating. But they're just not quite there yet with this full brain development and this developmental trajectory. So their primary tools, even though, their age might be 8, 10, 20 years old, whatever the age, and the demand and the expectation would be that they are there to use those visual cognitive skills. The reality is that their primary tools might exist in movement touch or in auditory verbal. So then the problem is then that we see their behavior, and that's going to tell us how they're primarily processing their world, which is going to tell us a lot about where they are in brain development. And we are going to explore that more in the next video. But so the first thing that we need to understand is just knowing that that brain is not fully developed at birth, and we need to move through this trajectory of development. And as we move through the trajectory of development, we gain different tools to engage within our world. We also need to know that there are some things that can interfere with the efficiency in which we move through development, which can create changes in the way that we engage within our world. Again, we're going to visit that with a hierarchy of development in video 3. But for now, here's the other thing that we know about stress. And if the brain is not fully developed at birth, we know that there's a lot of research that shows us that physical, chemical, and emotional stress is actually shown to impact the trajectory of brain development. So what does that mean? It means that if we have increased stress and a decreased ability to handle it or to be resilient to it, we can and we do see physical, chemical, emotional changes that can have a negative impact on the way the brain moves through this development, and therefore behavior, learning, mental health, challenges, and the ability to later connect in life. So we understand that the brain is not fully developed at birth, and we also understand that stress in all of its forms can have this negative impact on brain development, which then changes the way that we can engage within our world and may create some challenges for kids and adults lifelong. The other thing we know is that it's not just a magical thing. Like we have a kid or an adult who happens to be in a stressful situation and a light switch just flips. And this can impact the way that the brain is processing or the way that the brain is growing. What happens is there's some changes that can happen inside of the brain and the body as a result of stress, kind of like a fuse. Some of the things when we look at impacts of stress are that we can create this autonomic imbalance. So too much stress can then put us into this fight or flight scenario. And in this fight or flight scenario, we create what we call an issue within our autonomic nervous system, which means we have more sympathetic or fight or flight or freeze and less of our parasympathetic, which is that rest and recovery, growth and digest side of our nervous system. So when we're shifted into that fight or flight side of the nervous system, that's not very conducive to healthy brain development. So when we have too much stress and an inability to adapt to the stress, and the stress is kind of overcoming the amount of resilience that we have to adapt to it, or there's just too much stress of any form, physical, chemical, emotional, then what happens is we create these changes that flip us to this fight or flight. So two of those changes in our body that need to be measured and addressed to make sure that we can flip back to that balanced autonomic state then, so we can continue to have healthy growth. One of those changes is neural structural shifting of the spine, particularly in the upper neck. We can have issues with the cranium and the entire spine, which are kind of like a fuse blowing. So the brain can only take so much stress, and we can get they're called subluxations or neural structural shifts, which are known to, when we look at the measurement and the objective as exam indicators, when we're testing to see if we have this, one of the things we're looking for is to see that has the nervous system shifted into that fight or flight mode. So we have to address that. We need to reduce the stress. We need to improve the balance in the autonomic nervous system so we can facilitate healthy growth and development. The other thing is we can have this breakdown as a result of too much stress, breakdown of the healthy gut walls. We can have an increase in bad bacteria, a decrease in good bacteria in the gut, and then we can have inflammation. We can have stress in the gut, and then stress in the gut can also create stress in the brain, and again, cause that imbalance of the nervous system and put us more into that fight or flight or freeze mode, which is a thing that can have a negative impact on brain development. So you see, when we look at what we know, it tells us really clearly what we need to do to start to uncover how to support healthy brain development, what we need to do to make sure that, one, we don't have too much stress, and that it's not a one-size-fits all, but we really need to make sure that in each child, each adult, in each human, that we have that healthy autonomic nervous system balance between the sympathetic and the parasympathetic, and that we're not getting stuck in that fight or flight, because that's where we start to see a breakdown of the developmental trajectory. If we're talking about development or even other systems in the body, we can only live in that fight or flight for so long without seeing a negative consequence. And living in that fight or flight then pushes us to be more active in our brainstem, which fights directly against the healthy development. And it's going to be very, very impactful and counterproductive to healthy brain development. So we always have to look at these three things. The brain is not fully developed at birth. We need to go through this healthy trajectory of development. And we know that there can be some alterations in that, which might cause changes in the way that we engage within our world. So, therefore, if we're having a behavior, a learning, or a socialization challenge, we need to first look at not to try to cover it up, but we need to look at it so we can understand it. And in order to do that, we have to look at what the different stressors are, and most importantly, what are the results of those stressors? Is this individual adapting to them, or is it having an impact on the way that the brain is functioning? Or has it had an impact on the way that the brain has gone through or is continuing to go through development? This is absolutely critical. We address all of these areas to see what we can do to help maintain healthy development, or in the case of those behavioral, learning, socialization challenges, get to the root of the problem and not just cover things up so that we have to deal with them down the road. Instead, we want to help support healthy development and get to the root of the problem now and maintain a healthy trajectory of development for a better life for right now and definitely a better life for the future. So, watch the next video to dig in a little bit more into deflected brain development. And then in that next video, we're also going to talk a little bit more about what you can do about it and what those stress responses might look like.